In this episode of Chai on the Moon, I chat with Dr. Erika Nesvold, author of Off Earth: Ethical Questions and Quandaries for Living in Outer Space. Here we have a wide ranging conversation about topics such as the issues of ownership of the moon, about incarceration in space, about genetic engineering and living on the lunar surface, and about the fascinating challenge of burials on the moon. Let me introduce our guest. Our guest is Dr. Erika Nesvold. She's an astrophysicist. So that's a little bit close. That always softens my heart. She's an astrophysicist with a PhD in physics and a background in computational astrophysics research. She has worked as a researcher at NASA's Goddard Center and the Carnegie Institute of Science. And as she says, she enjoys teaching computers how to simulate the universe. And she's a developer for a universe sandbox, which many people probably know about this. And if you're not, just check it out. It's really cool. You can actually play around, create the universe, and give different things collide and stuff like that. So it's a physics-based space simulator. But more relevant for us here, she is also interested in thinking about building a better future in space. And the lessons, and using the lessons we learned from history, ethics, and social sciences. She's co-founder of the nonprofit organization Just Space Alliance and is the creator and host of the podcast Making New Worlds. And even more impressive, she has a book out just recently. It's called Off Earth: Ethical Questions and Quandaries for Living in Outer Space. Welcome, Erika.
Thank you so much. I wish I had made myself some chai, but I am on the moon here in my bathroom. So.
There you go. Perfect. This series, as I mentioned, we will be talking about various kinds of, not necessarily technical challenges, but rather about the human and societal issues related to human settlements in space, and in specific to the upcoming moon settlements, because to a certain degree, when we talk about Mars and other things, those are interesting, and we are going to talk about it today. But that's a little bit far into the future, whereas the moon is something that's about to happen. I mean, it's closer than we think it is. I mean, in some sense. And I thought that you will be a perfect guest because in your book, which I highly recommend, and I will have a link in the description to it, you lay out a number of things that people may or may not have thought about in terms of what kind of challenges come in. As you're an astrophysicist and you are interested in these things, let's start with just asking this question, which you've been asked a lot. You talk about it in your book also. Why would you write a book about ethical issues or societal issues in terms of human settlements?
Great question, especially since I'm not an ethicist, right? So how did I get thinking about these topics? I was doing some astrophysics research out near Silicon Valley, where a lot of these tech companies and private space companies are starting up. And I got the chance to meet a few people working in the private space industry, especially in particular people who wanted to do mining on the moon, for example. They wanted to mine water out of the moon to sell to people who want to live there, for example. And I was kind of disappointed by these conversations because I would ask questions about things that don't have to do with the technology. What are we going to do about labor relations with these space miners? How are we going to avoid contaminating the lunar surface as we go about our mining? And I just kept getting really dismissive answers like, oh, well, we'll worry about that later, which didn't seem like the right answer to me. But I also recognized that I didn't know the right answers either, because just like the people I was talking to, I'm a trained physicist. I've barely had any ethics classes or social sciences classes at all. And so when I came back, I made a podcast, Making New Worlds, in which is really just an excuse for me to ask people who do know the answers to these questions. So I talked to historians, especially colonial historians, and I talked to sociologists and people who work on environmental justice and activists of various flavors. And I learned so much about all these similar problems we're struggling with on Earth, but also that we have good lessons learned about what's worked and what hasn't here on Earth that we can hopefully apply to space if we just make an effort.
Oh, that's wonderful, and that comes off. I mean, your book is very broad ranging, and it's sort of like, and of course, when you are thinking about space, you have to think about the Earth because that's where we are. And if humans are going from here, in some sense, we don't have to reinvent the wheel. But on the other hand, there are a lot of problems that we have created. So it's not about reinventing the wheel, but it's also about, can we learn lessons and not take those things with us? So regarding this, I have a really broad question to start with, and that is something that comes up more and more as people are concerned about climate change issues here on Earth, or what is happening on Earth, both in terms of what to do and also that we should take care of the Earth. So in a broader sense, and this is more about your personal perspective, should humans go to space? Should humans settle in space? And I know this is a broad question, but I want to take your input on it as somebody who is into sciences, who's an astrophysicist. How do you see that question?
I think it's a key question, number one, that all of us should be asking ourselves, not just at the start of our work, but continually throughout and at the end of the work as well. Because there are people who argue that we shouldn't as a species, that we're not ready, that we need to mature before we deserve or should be inflicted upon the universe. And I think it's important to have conversations with people who have those opinions because they make some really good points. I don't fully agree with them, though, partly because I don't think that humanity will ever agree with each other on what it means to deserve to go to space. Certainly, there are people who think we deserve to right now. I think there are people who will never believe that we're worthy of leaving our planet. And the other reason is that I think we should go into space and we shouldn't hold ourselves back entirely is because I think we can learn so much from the effort that will help us both on Earth and in space. And NASA, for example, likes to talk a lot about their spin-off technologies, things that they invented for use in space, but then it turned out to be really useful here on Earth. So that includes things like Tang and Velcro that everyone wants to talk about, but also miniaturization of computer chips. I think that there is a good chance that we're also going to come up with sort of spin-off social technologies where we learn more about how to live together, how to live with our environment sustainably when we go to space. If we put the effort into learning those things, then those spin-off technologies can also help us live better with each other and the environment here on Earth.
So if I can push you a bit more on this question, and putting my cards on the table, I actually agree with you. I mean, like, I'm on this particular side, and of course, the concern is how we do it, right? I mean, so yeah. I think we should, and this is a criticism. I mean, when I encounter sort of like these kind of questions, is that okay? So because some people want to do it and some people don't want to do it, right? Is that a justification? Right. So if you are making a case, one thing is, well, this is what we have done, and hence we are going to do it because there will be benefit from it. But somebody can argue, but there could be negative aspects to it because look, what we have, our record here on Earth is not exactly the best record. So can you think about justification? That here is a and moral is a very high bar word, but sort of like, here is a case, here is a defense for going into space. So how would you think in terms of that?
I don't think I can give a bulletproof justification to go to space. And I think that's an important point because there are a lot of people who think that they do have a completely worthy justification for why humankind needs to go to space. And I investigate all of these different types of models for arguing to go to space in the book. And I kind of poke holes in some of them, not to say that they're all wrong, but I don't think any of them are foolproof. And in particular, I don't think any of them speak for all of humanity. And that's why I'm refusing to give you a justification, is because whatever my justification is, I know for a fact that there are people on this planet who won't agree with that. And so I cannot possibly claim to speak for humankind and why humankind should do something. I think I have a less black and white answer, which is just that I think people will, if it's technologically and economically feasible, I think people will do it. And so I'm focused more on, okay, well, how can we do this? Well, how can we actually make sure that we have benefits from it and not just harms? And maybe that's defeatist of me to say, well, it's going to happen anyway. Why fight it? But that's more what I focus on. But I stay away from any of the big narratives and mythology about why humanity as a species needs to do something, because I see a little too much of that in the space industry. And I guarantee you that private space companies haven't consulted all the humans on the planet. So.
And I would say, I mean, and the other way around too, that people who argue that humans should not, or humans are a curse on the universe or whatever, like, I mean, I think that also goes to this thing. So that's an interesting position, like, that, yeah, I mean, who speaks for Earth was a big question before also, like, and so in that sense, it's also this thing that who speaks for Earth in terms of making decision of whether we should go to space or not. So piggybacking on that particular thing, you write about in your book, there are a lot of issues related to property rights, which we're going to explicitly talk about, labor rights, human rights, many different things that we have to think about, we should think about when we go to space. And I am using the word now when, because practically speaking, whether we should go or not, it's pretty clear that we will go to space. And so out of all of these things, if I were to push you right now and say, okay, what is the one really big concern that you think, like, there are a lot of different ones, but here is one that you really have been struck by it and you go like, this is something that bothers me. I would say that it keeps you up at night, but then you're an astronomer, so like, that should be okay.
That's what I stay at night, yeah. Oh, there's so many. I mean, I read a whole book, right? If I only had one big thing, I wouldn't have been able to fill all those pages. I think the one that seems most urgent to me is environmental justice, which is kind of tied up with property rights. Property rights are one approach to how we manage this, but the idea that we are a threat to the space environment is pretty clear already when you look at low Earth orbit, which a lot of people don't think of as being an environment because it's not full of endangered frogs and rainforests and stuff. It's literally just empty space, but we're already causing a lot of damage to our own backyard by filling it up with technology and debris, which could very well make it unusable for us. And given that that's what we've done to the closest space environment to us, I worry that we're going to continue to cause damage to the moon or Mars or wherever we go, thus making it not only unusable to us, which is a problem for us, but just damaging something that's been there since before we even existed. That doesn't seem right. That I think is one of the more obvious issues in space. So there are people working on that already. There's some other things that jumped out at me as I started looking into this that I hadn't considered at all before, are issues like criminal justice in space, which doesn't get discussed much because there hasn't been a ton of crime in space. But if we get enough people up there, eventually some of them will start to hurt each other. And the question of what do we do about that is really deeply tied into, well, how do we handle criminal justice here on Earth? And the answer is not particularly well in many of our countries. And it attaches to all these bigger questions about how we want to live as a society.
All right, so and I want to get back to criminal justice issues as well, because I think those are some fascinating issues, and in fact, it flips that question. And in fact, you already mentioned sort of like not what it tells us about how we are dealing with these things here on Earth. So in some sense, it can be a reflection. But let's dive into the question of environmental ethics, and which also gets tied to, well, who would be responsible for it, which gets connected to property rights, right? I mean, to a certain degree, is it, whose responsibility is it, right? And so, and this is something that you write also, that this is one area of space law where there is considerable ink that has been spilled, and there is a lot of conversation about it. So people who are not familiar with that, can you say a little bit about who owns the moon, or what is the sort of like, if you were on the moon right now, if you were going on the moon, how would you define property rights?
Sure. So here's a little primer on space law, and I'll mention I'm not a space lawyer, but I've talked to a few. The big international law that covers space property rights is called the Outer Space Treaty of 1967, which you can tell by the name was written and signed during the Cold War, and it's actually a pretty impressive document based on that. It says things like we can't have nuclear weapons in space, which is nice, and it also says that no nation can appropriate territory in space, which means the US can't go up, plant a flag, and claim it the moon for America. You'll notice that we've done two of those things. We've gone up there and we've planted a flag, but they were very clear about the fact that that was just symbolic, and it wasn't claiming the moon as the 51st state, for example. But the Outer Space Treaty is not very clear on whether individuals or private corporations can claim territory. There's another treaty called the Moon Treaty that was more explicit about banning that, but it was not signed by any major spacefaring nations, so it's kind of a failed treaty. The Outer Space Treaty mostly just says that private, non-governmental individuals and organizations have to follow the laws and be supervised and regulated by the launching state. So if you launch from Florida, then you have to follow US laws. And so that's kind of where it's been left. And a lot of these questions haven't been tested in court yet because there hasn't been a big property dispute on the moon, but I'm sure there will be at some point. The US is with the Artemis Accords, which are some multilateral agreements that the US wrote themselves and then are asking other people to sign. They're trying to move in the direction that says, okay, nobody can own a patch of the moon, but if you mine the moon, if you pull resources out of the moon, then you own what you pulled out and thus can sell it. And they're trying to, people who want to make a good, thriving mining industry are pushing in that direction. But that's pretty close to owning a patch. So okay, you don't own the land you're standing on the moon, but you own the rocks you pull out of it is sort of the argument. And that won't necessarily prevent land conflicts, right? If two different groups want to mine the same patch of the moon, we still have to figure out what to do there. And it's not clear yet how that's going to work. The Outer Space Treaty says you can't have harmful interference with other people's activity on the moon. So we'll see how that's interpreted. Doesn't have a lot of strict rules for what that would look like. And none of this, you'll notice, protects the moon itself from us. It's just about which of us gets of the, if the two of us wanted to mine a patch of the moon, it tries to address that conflict, but not, does the moon have any intrinsic right to not be ripped up by mining, for example?
So if I can ask, because of the discovery of water ice, basically, and that is predominantly in the southern pole of the moon, and that's where it looks like, the US is planning missions over there. China is planning missions over there, and to a certain degree, that's that's a finite resource. It's unclear exactly how much water there is and how easy it would be to extract, but that's a finite resource. And so even without owning it, if one country is there and if another country comes in, how do you think that's going to get resolved? Because again, that is taking place on the moon. How do you think in terms of these type of things without ownership, but you are there? And I think Artemis Accord talks about safe zones, that, okay, so we are here, and so others should respect that, whatever that means, right? The safe zones. But if you have a finite resource, how would that play out?
Yeah, the Artemis Accords expand on the part of the Outer Space Treaty that says if someone is on, let's say, the moon, and another group wants to come in and conduct some nearby activities that are going to cause harmful interference. So say they want to put a landing pad right next to your telescope, the landing pad's going to kick up a lot of dust, then you need to have consultation. That's pretty vague. And so the Artemis Accords is trying to expand on that and say, okay, what if we delineate safe zones that say this is my telescope and here's the area around it where I don't want anyone landing their rockets, and let's have further discussions about how we would draw those lines and what that would look like. Now that is starting to draw maps and borders on the moon, which isn't quite national territorial appropriation, but it looks a lot like it. And so there's still a lot of questions about what that will look like. And then, yeah, there's still a lot of open questions about, okay, once you've drawn those lines, what do you do if someone crosses them? What do you, and all of this, the line drawing tends to be done in theory in these models by the person who gets there first. So if I happen to get to a nice patch of water ice on the south pole of the moon first and draw my safe zone and say, okay, nobody can come in here, is that fair? That leaves a lot of people behind, whoever couldn't build their space program up fast enough, for example. And there's worries that that's going to just perpetuate the sort of inequalities we have here on Earth, where we have big, rich spacefaring nations and little nations that haven't been able to build up a space program yet. If we carry that on in space, that the big, rich spacefaring nations are the ones who get to draw the borders around the valuable stuff on the moon, then that's just going to keep going in the future forever.
But to me, it seems like, I mean, it's not settled at all, because even, I mean, if you talk about the countries that can go, because it looks like the US has a plan, Artemis 3, I think it's the landing mission is for 2025, potentially, even if you plus a year or 2 years, but it's in the next couple of years. And then China is planning by 2030 or so, or around that time. So if there is a particular dispute in terms of the best site, or say, for example, the drawing the safe zone is bigger, right? And China comes in and says, no, we actually need that too. The likelihood right now to resolve it is going to be the UN here, or is it going to be sort of like bilateral? I mean, I'm just trying to figure out, because to me, I don't know. Yeah,
I honestly, I can't predict either, partly because I'm not an international lawyer, and partly because I think nobody really knows yet what it's going to be like. The UN, I would think, in my opinion, the UN would be a good place to do this. The UN has a committee on the peaceful uses of outer space. They've been thinking about all of these problems for a long time. They work on a lot of the aspects of the Outer Space Treaty, but then the US came along and said, oh, we're going to make the Artemis Accords. We're going to write them ourselves, not go through the UN. And we're just going to ask everyone to come join our club. So it does feel like some countries, including my own, are trying to go around the UN to perhaps gain an advantage, or they might argue to instill their own values and make sure that their values are being prioritized. So I think the UN would be a good place to have that sort of third-party mediation and consultation happening. That's what it's for. But the powerful countries like to avoid the UN when it serves their interests. So I'll put it
right, and that's what China and Russia are arguing, that, well, we don't accept Artemis Accord. We don't want to sign out of it. I don't know if China would even be invited to it, but that we cannot sign it because, look, they are bypassing UN because they may be going a little bit later. So
the Artemis Accords are also not legally binding, I'll point out.
That's right. Okay, that's a really good point. Okay, so setting that aside, because it seems like, and that's a big setting aside, this thing, setting aside, so how do you see this concern that you said, sort of like, the one of the biggest concerns you have regarding that is about our impact on space, or low Earth orbit, but also on the moon. So here you have countries going in, okay, so we have set aside, maybe there is a kumbaya moment and countries are like, hey, look, we have saved you some good spot, that is for you, and we have this spot. So even if we imagine that, and one of the ideas on the moon is to potentially construct material over there, put it into orbit around the moon for future missions to Mars, and that would require altering the moon. So how do you think about this notion of taking care of the moon? How do we do that in a responsible way? How do we think about it other than just putting hands up in the air and says, yeah, well, what can we do?
Well, thinking about it all is an important step. Certainly, a lot of people, especially private space companies trying to get investors, will point to space as this infinite resource, right? That we have space is infinite, it's full of infinitely valuable goods. Let's all go and mine them. But as you've pointed out earlier, the amount of those valuable resources that we can actually reach is finite, and in particular, they're concentrated in particular locations. So even though right now the moon seems pretty big, orbital space around the moon seems pretty big, there's room for everybody. I doubt that the first two mining companies on the moon are going to try to end up in the same spot. We probably won't have that kind of conflict for at least a little while. But eventually, yeah, if humans are good at anything, it's exponential growth, right? And we can easily use up. We've seen this on Earth. We can use up the resources available to us much faster than we think, just because there's so many of us. And so the question is, how far in the future do we see that happening? And what does this mean not only for sharing resources with each other, but also sharing resources with future generations? Because if we use up all the water on the moon now, then future generations won't be able to use it. And what does this mean for the moon itself? Which is a strange concept for a lot of people who don't think of non-living stuff as having intrinsic value. It's very much a cultural idea, but there are plenty of cultures on Earth who see landscapes, rivers, mountains, for example, as having personhood. There's even been a couple of examples on Earth where a river in New Zealand, for example, was given legal personhood with a human person to represent it, to defend it from damage from people who want to do activities that would damage the river. And so there are some people arguing we should do that for the moon. There's a Declaration of the Rights of the Moon out there that you can go read. And again, this really stretches some people's concept of the idea that the moon is good for anything besides what we can use it for. But I think it's worth thinking about now instead of in 100 years when we've torn up the surface, for example. Especially the moon, which is so crucial to all of our experiences of the night sky, even more than Mars, certainly. We need to think about, does it belong to us? Does it belong to all of us? Does it belong to none of us? Does it belong to itself? What do we want to do? What kind of values do we want to put into our legal system to decide what we do as a species with this big rock?
And people who might want to think about sort of like what an odd, if they think it's an odd concept that natural landscapes can have sort of like value in themselves, or a personhood in that context. Like I should remind, especially for American audience, that corporations were also declared as people, and so we can think about these things, and people are used to it. But again, that is in a very particular context, within a capitalist context as well, that corporations can be considered as people. Okay, so you can also imagine, for other people also about moon being considered that, and there are United Nations declares sort of like a world heritage, and then those areas get protected, and so then that could also be this question, like that how much can we dig up the moon, how much can we deface it to a certain degree, what is the point, or is it just like these cobalt mines or various kinds of mines that happen that you just strip out sort of like mountains? And that is a big question to ask. Can we do that to the moon? And how we think about it.
And you mentioned heritage sites. There's a group called For All Moonkind, which is trying to protect historical sites of historical value on the moon. So this isn't about the moon itself, but rather the Apollo 11 landing site, for example, and various other places that are historical, of historical importance to us. So, for example, the boot print of the first step onto the moon is still sitting there because there's not wind or weather to blow it away. But once we start sending mining activity or whatnot and landing other rockets, we could easily destroy that without even noticing. And so For All Moonkind argues that we should designate those as heritage sites. And other people have suggested that we create a park system in space on the moon or Mars to designate certain areas as natural landscapes, not to let wildlife flourish there, which is why a lot of parks exist on Earth, but rather to make sure that we have these pristine as we can get, zones that we preserve for future generations.
And indigenous groups, can offer a lot of indigenous knowledge sort of like on Earth. That offers a lot in terms of how they have seen this kind of relationship to natural landscapes. And so that is something that could be the framework to think about the moon as well.
Absolutely. And even if you're someone who really can't wrap your head around the idea of the personhood or the intrinsic value of a landscape. You have to at least acknowledge that indigenous cultures that do have this approach to the natural world are also really good at living sustainably within their natural world. So maybe there's something practical at the very least that you can get out of the idea that we should consult these non-Western and indigenous worldviews. Certainly consult them to see what their thoughts are and how we should use space, but also, be willing to consider that perhaps other cultures have approaches to land use and environmental use that can improve all of us.
Yeah, and I should mention that in your book, I really appreciated sort of like this discussion about this, because it also came up sort of like, and there is no single indigenous view of sort of like, this relationship either. I mean, there are also multiple viewpoints, and you can interact with that. You can actually sort of like, explore those type of things. It's just like there is no single way of thinking about it, but we should all be, again, putting value in that. Our goal is how to minimize our detrimental impact. And so how do we learn from different systems to approach it? I want to shift gears a little. And there was something that really struck me, a couple of things, especially towards in your book, where you talk about how are we going to be living in space. And one of the things that really struck me was about this issue of your warning about potential eugenics. So your eugenics is, again, the idea sort of like, of selective either breeding or selective sort of inhibition of certain races. And it has a terrible, ugly history on Earth, which is deeply tied to racism and various types of things. And you bring up this issue that when we are thinking about human colonies in space, and again, colony, that wrong word, settlements, human settlements in space, that is something that we should think about, and we should start thinking about it now. It gets to the question of who gets to go to space as well. But tell me a little bit about sort of like, this, what is your concern, and how do you connect the issue of going to space, which is sort of like, the big sort of like humanity moment in some sense, for somewhat a romanticized notion, but then you have a warning regarding bringing up eugenics. How do these two things come together?
Yeah, so the idea of how would you create a sustainable human population in space is sort of an interesting question, just scientifically. How many people do you need to make sure you have enough genetic diversity so that you don't end up with the sort of heritable diseases that we see in really small populations on Earth? How do we decide who gets to go, and assuming we can reproduce in space and have a healthy population going on? And it turns out that this question can lead to a lot of repeats of the horrific arguments that people have made in the past on Earth. So we need to be aware of them. So for example, if you said, I'm going to send 1,000, 10,000 people off to another star system. Let's go really far out there, so no one else is going out there. They're not coming back. They have to be able to reproduce. How would we pick those people? If you're really prioritizing success of the mission over inclusivity, for example, you could end up making a lot of choices like, oh, we don't want to choose anyone with an inheritable genetic disease. We want to choose people who can physically perform the tasks that are needed. And then you start thinking, well, maybe we should choose people who are specifically their physical makeup is specifically beneficial in space. That would in particular be smaller people, shorter people like myself, because they require less thrust to get them into space. But other things like better eyesight, maybe people we consider to be more intelligent, if we make up a definition for intelligence. And then that starts to really move in the direction of eugenics, because at that point, you're deciding what makes a good human and what makes a good human population. And it's easy to get far beyond physical health and move into selecting for things that have been selected for in the past by people who want to conduct eugenics. And that will continue in the future if we say, want to control populations within a space settlement. We want to make sure the settlement doesn't get too big or too small. You can end up saying, okay, well, then we need to prioritize having children that are healthy enough to give labor back to the settlement. And that's just a terrible thought. Like when you think about all the children on Earth that have disabilities or something else when they're born that that a very cold and calculating utilitarian would say, well, this person as an adult isn't going to be able to contribute this threshold of physical labor to the community, so they're not worth anything to us. That just takes us down a terrible, unethical path.
Right, and you also mentioned a bit about sort of like, that those kind of decisions. I mean, this could start as practical, and we also have to figure out who is making those decisions, because again, one person's fitness, and there is again ugly history about that, because you can also think about fitness race-wise, right? And people do hold these kind of views. But do you think this is something, and you mentioned the number, which a lot of people actually use, even though that's, I think, a lower number, 10,000 for a stable community. Say if you are thinking about Mars, that's not going to be on the moon, because moon is probably going to be sort of like, just as an outpost, but Mars. So if you have 10,000 people on the lower end, do you think this is something, how far in advance do we have to think about it? Because does it lead to, if we don't think properly about these kind of issues, especially in terms of genetic diversity as well, which is a complicated thing because you are explicitly thinking about genetic diversity, right? So that is not, and again, who is thinking about it, and so on and so forth, because once you start doing that, it comes up. How serious do you think would be this issue for the long-term survival of a settlement? Or do you think it's going to create issues that may lead to collapse, or may lead to sort of like, a couple of generations of this settlement?
It's so hard to predict specific outcomes, especially where we're sitting right now. We don't even know if it's possible to have children in space, right? So this could all be a moot point. But in general, the conflicts are going to come down to the utilitarian survival of the settlement. The settlement's going to collapse if we don't make the right choices, versus why are we trying to survive in the first place if our only alternatives is to create this sort of eugenicist, horrific, like oppressive society? What is the point? What are we doing here at all? Is it to make sure that we just have the numbers, that we just have as many human lives on the balance sheet as possible, or is the point to expand our civilization, to perpetuate our values? And if one of our values is that every human has the right to live and is, has intrinsic value in their own right, regardless of what they can contribute to a society, then we're going to make different choices in trying to preserve those values, including potentially risking the long-term survival of the settlement, versus just trying to make sure we get the numbers in and are as safe as possible. And that's something we have to face here on Earth a lot. Dictatorships are often come about because they're arguing that the dictator is the only one who can save the nation, right? Defend them from an external threat, whatnot. And then they can end up in really horrible places. On Earth, we at least have enough humans here that we're not, at the moment, really worried about the collapse of civilization due to something like genetic diversity. But in the future, yeah, those are the kind of arguments we're going to have. Is survival worth it if we're creating a horrific place to live? And is there something between these two extremes? Surely this is a spectrum between absolutely brutal and cold choices that we would make to perpetuate eugenics and make sure that the settlement survives, versus completely instilling our values but perhaps collapsing. And I also don't think that spectrum is even linear, by which I mean the way I just laid it out is probably not realistic. We don't have to have eugenics for a settlement to survive in space. I don't believe that that's true. And so people arguing in that direction, I think we can push back against it. But that doesn't answer your question of how I think it'll play out, because it's so hard to know at this stage. But those are the big conflicts that we'll have.
Oh, I love it. I mean, I think there's something that you said, that what's the point of doing all of these things if we end up replicating some of the worst tendencies of humans? I mean, to a certain degree, like, if we end up like, okay, well, if we, again, in an extreme case, if we have that type of a colony or that kind of a settlement, what's the point? And I think that's a really key point. And I think that's what you are arguing, that's why we ask why we are going. right in the beginning,
Exactly.
because I think what values we are bringing, rather than saying, hey, let's go because we can go, but rather than, okay, here are our values, and then when we have to make tough decisions, because there will be a lot of decisions which we don't know exactly what shape they are going to take in the future, then we can go back to our values and say, wait a minute, okay, so does this challenge and the solutions that we are thinking about, whether they sync up with our values or not, what we wanted to do. So, by the way, just a side question. I looked over there because I was just checking in. Did you read Seven Eves by Neil Stephenson?
Not yet. I've read
Okay.
some other Neil Stephenson, but not Seven Eves. Yeah.
Okay, because I don't want to give a spoiler, but there is a deep discussion about particular these questions. But in there is an extreme scenario. So, continuing on this thing in this trend about values. And here is something that, again, you talked about in your book, and while reading it, something that was coming to my mind, and that was about, in some sense, you have a chance, or we have a chance, and you, I mean humans, we have a chance of bringing our values and creating a society. I mean, do you think this can also serve as an experiment, a utopian experiment? Because we are, rather than being adrift in terms of, here is how human settlements have gone here on Earth, how we have gone in, it has happened. Where we are is where we are. But now that we are talking about Mars, we can, in theory, bring our best values to it, right? We can actually argue, hey, what do we really value amongst humans? So do you think there could be, we can think in terms of a sort of like, this society which has the best values that we can think of? And then, of course, with the caveat that utopian societies on Earth don't have a good track record either. So how do you think that bit?
So a lot of people have argued for space settlements as these sort of laboratories, these sociological laboratories that G.K. O'Neill in particular, he advocated for space station settlements that are just free floating. And he said, this is great. They can be labs. We can try all the different political systems and economic systems and see what works and what doesn't in these isolated labs, which sounds nice as a scientist. If you think about the fact that humans have to live inside the ones that are failing, that's not ideal either. And certainly there's a lot of people who believe in this sort of techno-utopianism that we can create utopias in space. I do not believe that we will be able to create utopias in space. And I don't think we should be trying because, as you mentioned, we have had deliberate, designed from the ground up communities here on Earth of people attempting to create tiny communes or utopias to demonstrate that their system is the best way to produce human happiness. And they don't have a particularly steady track record. I think instead what's going to happen in space, because the other thing in space is even if we're building a society from the ground up, nothing was there, and then we have a human community there, it doesn't mean that it's a blank slate. Everyone who comes from Earth to be the first generation of founders in that community is bringing all of their baggage from Earth, all of their preconceived notions about how society should be run, all of their biases, their logical fallacies, and their value systems. And so I think I tend to think of space settlements instead as being extensions of different parts of our civilization, like an amoeba reaching out its little pods. And I think that the new fresh environment and the deliberateness of the construction of these communities, the fact that we are having these conversations, means there'll be a lot more attention paid to what are our values, what systems do we want to put into place. And there's a lot of value in that. But I don't think it guarantees that there'll be utopias, certainly, because I think a lot of us will just be wrong about what the best way to set up these communities are. In that way, there'll be laboratories, whether we want them to be or not. And also because the environment of space is going to be a deeply unpleasant place to live. I think it's a lot easier to create a happy, thriving society when you don't have any resource scarcity, and we're going to find the most resource scarce place we can find. The technology that we'll be bringing along will be advanced, but we won't be able to fall back on our environment the way we often can here on Earth. So, for example, on Earth, there's a lot of benefit to the fact that if you really need a break from your social environment, whether you're getting banished because you don't agree with them or whether you just need to strike it on your own, you can just do that. You can walk out into the woods and you're going to face death from starvation or exposure, but at the very least you can breathe. And that fundamental thing that we've always had on Earth is not going to exist in space. We're going to have to depend on our shared technology and our community much more than we ever had on Earth. Maybe that'll make us better. Maybe that'll make things worse.
Right. So let's extend that to something that we talked earlier on, and that was about the criminal justice system, right? And one of the things is, okay, so if you have done crime in space and space is not something, I mean, say, for example, if you are on the moon or Mars, it's not a place where you can just hosting somebody in detention, for example, is extremely expensive, especially if that person is not contributing, which everybody, it's a small community, everybody has to contribute, so on and so forth. So how do you think about that? And there is a chapter in your book as well. So how do you think about criminal or like, sort of like this kind of legal issues in a space settlement, and then can we learn something for Earth or vice versa? How do you think about these issues?
So if you're imagining crime in space, I think the example I give in my book is that someone has stolen someone else's boots, right? So we tend to think of interpersonal crime like violence or theft. Of course, there's all sorts of crimes that can happen, including the organization against an individual, like oppression or wage theft or whatnot. But if we're just thinking of interpersonal crime, there's all sorts of questions right at the start. Who responds to a crime? Who decides who is accused? Who judges the accused? What system of laws are using? All of those questions are related to governance in general. But once you get to the point where you say, okay, the community has decided that this person is guilty of causing this harm, what do we do about it? The first instinct as someone who grew up in the US is to say, okay, well, you put them in space jail, right? You put them in a prison. But it turns out, as you mentioned, that's extremely impractical. You have to build the prison, which adding anything to the habitat requires a lot. You need heat, you need pressure, you need air, you need light, you need the physical space itself. So someone's got to do all that. You need resources and labor for that. Maybe you need labor to be the guards, depending on what kind of technology you have. So that removes some labor from the labor pool. And then you remove the imprisoned person themselves from the labor pool. And labor might very well be a major shortage. And that's just extremely impractical. And then it turns out that any alternative you can think of based on our culture, my culture in the US, is also terrible. Well, you could force them to work. And in fact, in the US, we have an exception in our Constitution that says slavery is against the Constitution unless they're convicted of a crime, and then you can force people to work without paying them. That can lead to a lot of horrific abuses. And the alternatives of, well, you could banish them, you could kick them out of your community. Well, that's just kicking someone out on the surface of the moon, right? So that's essentially a death sentence. And so it all gets very complicated. And then you start to realize that the prisons themselves aren't just impractical, but they're pretty awful, oppressive, violent, potentially places, especially if we're already suffering from the fact that we're living outside of our natural environment. So maybe we're living in tunnels under the surface of Mars. We're already all kind of depressed because it's dark and we don't have any windows. And then you lock someone up even further. That can't possibly be good for their own mental health and their future in the community, which leads you to look back on our prison system in the US on Earth and realize how oppressive and unethical and violent and not useful for society that those prisons are. But just when you start to get really depressed about all of this, I did more research and realized that there are a lot of movements arguing that there's other ways to address this kind of harm and so-called deviant behavior in the communities. And a lot of other cultures on Earth use these approaches. And there's a push to use things called, for example, restorative justice here in the US, which is an approach that centers the victim of a crime and say, what does the victim really need? Studies have shown that locking up the perpetrator doesn't really help the victim automatically. So does the victim need maybe some mediated conversation with the perpetrator? Depending on the crime, that could be very helpful and provide a lot of closure. Do we need to focus on reducing recidivism and how to help the person who committed the crime to reintegrate into society? Should we be focusing on that instead? And I discovered that it's much easier for me personally to think about these solutions and these different ideas, and even really radical ideas like no prisons, no cops. It's easier for me to imagine that on the moon because I'm already in this futuristic sci-fi mindset. And then I can allow myself to consider these different models in a way that I never could thinking about the US, because it's so hard, even if you accept that there's a better way of doing things on Earth, it's so hard to imagine how we get there from here, from our private prison system that's caused a lot of problems in the US. But if you can imagine it in space, then that makes it a lot easier to say, well, maybe this is a better solution on Earth. Maybe this is something we can get to without having to go to the moon to get it.
Right. I mean, and I think that some of the best science fiction does that, right? I mean, there is something. Okay, can you imagine a society where X, right? Like, and I think that's the power of science fiction, and that's the power of thinking about the future as well. I mean, the whole Star Trek sort of like, interracial aspect, sort of like back in the 60s, that you couldn't put it on TV, but you say, oh, but it's in the future, it's in space. It's like, oh, that's all right. Like, so I mean, I think that can genuinely, that can provide insight about, again, reflection on us. So a couple of things I want to touch on, and before we're gonna sort of like wind up, we talked about eugenics and genetics aspect a little while back, and then you also talked about everything in some sense is related to the harsh conditions of space, right? I mean, like including the governmental whatever structure you would have of governance, crime, what to do with that. In everything, we are really operating in a pretty tough conditions. Now, there are some suggestions about sort of like genetic modifications, say, for example, for living on Mars, like, that, okay, or even on the moon, right? I mean, if you can resist some sort of radiation or whatever, like, if you have genes about that, would that help, and things like that. How do you see that aspect? And also, to a certain degree, because that would be something that you may need to have as a prerequisite, right? So we were talking about how to be careful in terms of genetic diversity and all of these things. But what if you say, okay, well, here is a way to modify humans for the settlement, and that modification in some sense is necessary, kind of like the COVID vaccine, sort of like, okay, do you have a vaccination card or not? And then the impact, because some of those people, maybe if there are certain things that we can modify that may, say, for example, they're more suitable for low gravity, right? Which may make it impossible for them to come back to Earth, and so on and so forth. How do you think about those kind of things that modify humans, but makes them live more suitably in those environments?
So I didn't really discuss intentional genetic modification in the book, although I keep being asked about it. But it was intentional because that I avoided that topic. Not because I don't think it's important, and certainly not because other people aren't thinking about these things, but because it's part of a much larger question about the ethics of genetic modification that I don't think is limited at all to space. Because space is not the only context where we're going to say, oh, maybe we should modify humans to be more able to withstand the radiation, or more able to, I don't know, live underwater, or whatever we want people to be able to do here on Earth. And I think that's honestly a topic that's worthy of an entire other book, and there are other people focusing on the ethics of that technology. However, setting aside the possibility of intentional genetic modification, if we manage to be able to reproduce and live sustainably in space, then the population living in space will undoubtedly diverge genetically from the population on Earth, depending on how much mixing there is. But presumably, if they're far away, there's not going to be a lot of mixing. And that will happen because of the space environment and just because populations that are separate from each other tend to evolve in different directions. I'm sure they'll have a different linguistic drift too. We'll end up with different languages and dialects and cultures, holidays and sports and such. They'll all diverge in space. And one thing I do worry about is the possibility that genetic change, or even just the natural effects of living in a different gravity system, will make it difficult for people to come back to Earth, or people who were born in space to visit Earth for the first time. And that's something I worried about a little in the book. I kind of said, is this ethical? Are we somehow taking away a child's birthright by making it so that they can't ever return to the planet where they evolved? But on further research, I realized that this is a decision that people on Earth have to make all the time when they're refugees and considering taking their child away from the place that their lineage had existed for generations, taking them to potentially an unknown, even more dangerous situation they don't know for sure, and changing their culture. You take them to another country and they're going to learn a new language. They're never potentially going to go back to the place where you were born. And that's a decision people have to make all the time. And they make that decision based on the interest of their children. And I think that's just what we'll continue to do in space.
And the passageway for oftentimes for these refugees is sometimes even more riskier than going to space.
Yeah.
And I think that's, we keep on hearing those stories as well. And I'm an immigrant as myself, not a refugee, as an immigrant. And I think, I have a kid, and I can imagine sort of like, it's a very different context. And that choice was made by me to a certain degree. And I think those are, and that leads to sort of like, interesting questions about identity in terms of second generation and things like that. And that would be far more extreme, as you can imagine, if you are on the moon, where you can see the Earth. Oh yeah, my parents were from there or are from there. That would be, again, that's where my academic stuff comes in. Oh, that would be really fascinating to think about. But also, as from a human level, it's going to be pretty tough. I think that's a real question. Last couple of things. There was another thing that really struck me, which I had never thought about before, that you brought up in the book. And you talk about living in space, and you talk about the importance of rituals. You talk about which way is Makkah, talk about sort of like, that, okay, how can religions evolve, sort of like, how they're going to take sort of like, the Earth-based rituals over there. But what really struck me was, that goes a little bit on the morbid direction, but the issue of burial. I had not thought about it, like, that, so, people are going to be there and people are going to die. That is certain, so, and I had never thought about like, people bury here, and there is a particular way, and like that's where it gets connected to religious or non-religious context. But say a few words. Why would that be a challenge, say, for example, on the moon? If you die?
Well, so many challenges. So for one thing, many of our human burial, but not necessarily burial. I'm sure there's a better term for it, but body disposal, cultural practices are dependent on things that exist in the Earth environment that don't exist elsewhere, including, for example, the microbes that would break down a body if you buried it in the ground itself that you can bury things in. Other cultures leave a body out exposed to the elements, and they're consumed by wildlife. None of that's available in space. Even cremation involves a certain amount. You need a certain infrastructure for that. Not to mention that often burial rituals involve returning the body to the ecosystem, and it's a cycle, and it will eventually come back to the rest of the community. In space, perhaps you don't want to lose the resources, the water and the organic materials that you had to bring with you from Earth. That's in the body, and do you want to put that back, recycle that into the system somehow? And on Earth, when you bury someone, you don't tend to think about that coming back to you directly, but in space, it's a much smaller ecosystem. And if that gets a lot shorter, it starts to feel much more like cannibalism, for example. And so are we going to be able to adjust culturally to that idea? A lot of people have explored these ideas in science fiction. I highly recommend Mary Robinette Kowal's Lady Astronaut trilogy, which has to deal with someone dying aboard a ship and following a procedure that had been proposed by NASA that in order to basically flash freeze and break down the body, that ends up being extremely traumatizing to the people who have to do it, who knew this person that died. And then even beyond all those considerations, there are cultures on Earth, there's several North American indigenous cultures who have, and the Pacific Islanders as well, who have a lot of taboos or cultural practices around the proper treatment of human remains. And so there's controversy over the fact that there are human remains on the moon. Gene Shoemaker's ashes were sent to the moon without any consultation with widespread consultation on Earth, and there are indigenous groups that are really upset about the fact that human remains were placed on the moon without any thought to whether some communities or cultures would consider that desecration, for example. And so that's going to be a question too, is where do you put these human remains? And especially if you don't own the land, if that land isn't yours, if you're considered a visitor there. Oh, so many questions to talk about. And yet it's going to come up, right? Because people will die in space if we're there long enough.
By the way, just out of curiosity, I mean, what do you think? I mean, especially say, for example, on the moon, what will people do? I mean, other than that, I mean, I think in the more near future, they can send the body back to Earth.
Right.
But
if you can't send the body back to Earth, burying them on a planet without a microbial ecosystem will be like freezing them. Basically, it's not going to actually
preserving them.
I think that there are at the moment a lot of the cultures that are at the forefront of arguing to go and live in space are also cultures that are perfectly fine with cremation. So I think cremation's up there, and I think potentially if you're living in a space settlement where everything biological is recycled, perhaps, a lot of cultural taboos about that will be broken, and we'll just figure out how to recycle them better. And that will match the community's value system about preserving and recycling everything. Whatever we do, it'll have to align with the culture of the people within that community.
I think that is really cool. I mean, this is ultimate recycling. Also, by the way, Dune, for example, where the water is so important, and we are mostly so anyway, I don't want to talk too much about the morbidness about it, but I think this is really really interesting. So just I want to ask to round up, you had a podcast about these issues, which also inspired your book as well alongside with that. That podcast was about a few years ago. What was, if you were to pick up sort of here is one thing that I was completely shocked by when you started doing your podcast to where you are now, and you go well, this is something that's really, I'm surprised that my view has diametrically changed about that. What would be one thing from where you started to where you are now?
So before I started researching these issues, I hadn't thought much about criminal justice. That's a big one. And now I consider myself almost to the point of being a prison abolitionist because of thinking about these issues in space and because of learning more about the subject. I became a lot more concerned about labor rights that I talk a lot about. We haven't discussed that today, but I talk a lot about labor rights in the book. And the environmental ethics that we talked about earlier, and whether lifeless landscapes have any intrinsic value, not something I had ever considered before. And I'm not even entirely sold on that idea right now. Just intuitively, I'm much more focused on the intrinsic value of life, whether that's human life or an ecosystem. But now that I've considered it and realized that there are a lot of cultures who would consider lifeless landscapes to have ethical value, that really shifted my whole idea of space, which is something I've studied for my entire career, which was really fascinating to me.
That's great. And there were so many questions. So you are absolutely right. Labor rights actually was on the list, but we just moved in a slightly different direction.
Hard to fit it in an hour.
It's hard to fit in, but what can people do? I mean, so you have a book. So first of all, of course, people should buy
my book.
Off Earth. And I think that's Ethical Questions and Quandaries for Living in Outer Space. But a lot of people are concerned. I mean, I think, and that is a good thing. In the last few years, I've been also seeing more and more of these concerns coming up. But at the same time, of course, and it's related to the fact that there is a lot more discussion about going to the moon. I mean, that's also happening, Artemis mission. And then, of course, there are landers that are going in. I think just this year, there are going to be several landers about to be going to the moon. So what can people do who are concerned about these things? How should they respond? How should they give up? Should they feel powerless?
No,
or what should
of course I'm not going to say that. No, so having these conversations is crucial, of course. And that's true of anything that you care about in the world. Climate change, for example, they tell you having conversations is crucial. If there's a particular issue we talked about today or that I mentioned in my book, or you come up with yourself, I think one of the most important things you can do if you're worried about one of these ideas in space is to learn more about what that problem looks like on Earth and what people have done to address it. Because it turns out there have been a lot of successes on Earth that we can learn from. And so learning from the actual experts here on Earth and the activists who have worked on these problems and the communities that have suffered with these problems, great place to start. The other thing I'll point to is from the other direction, is to look at your organizations, the parts of the world that you do have control over, whether that's a company you work in or just at the family or community level, and decide whether it expresses the values that you would want to see expressed in space. And if not, focus there, focus locally, focus on what you can control, because the better we make our societies and laws here on Earth, the more likely we are to perpetuate a better, happier, more just society as we go into space and back on Earth in the future.
And I think the climate change is a good example where there are large corporations and they are doing what they are doing, but they can be pushed to change their priorities to a certain degree towards a better, more sustainable way. And I think that's the same thing would go with space companies as well.
From climate change activists and scientists, which I find really valuable, is the idea that you can't just talk to people about the end of the world, about how this is going to destroy everything, because that psychologically that doesn't motivate people to action. It makes them fearful, it makes them sad, but it doesn't necessarily motivate them to action. What works really well, and I think this is true for space too, is to ask them to come up with a vision of a society, of a future that they do want to see, and work towards that instead of just running away from something they're afraid of today. And so that's what I try to do too. It's really easy to get horrified by the potential dystopian future we're setting up for ourselves in space, but you can do the opposite. You could say, okay, well, what's the opposite of that? What do I want my descendants to experience in space, and how can we work towards that?
Great. That's a good optimistic point to stop. And I should mention that you are also co-founder of Just Space Alliance, which is dealing with some of these issues. And there is a great place for resources up there. And of course, there are a lot of references in your book as well. Please check that out. Erika, thank you so much for your time and for diving into some of these issues. It was really a pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you. I had a great time.